Bell Street had once been the kind of road people described with pride. It was lined with respectable houses, clipped hedges, polished porch rails, and the quiet conviction that decent curtains could keep disorder outside. By 1952, the paint had begun to peel on some of the facades, and the men who returned from war had brought back a look in the eyes that no parade ever quite removed. But the street still carried itself with dignity. At number 14 stood the one exception. It was a narrow, dark house with a steep roof and a second-floor window that faced the street like an unblinking eye. No one had lived there in 17 years. Children hurried past it. Adults pretended not to look at it. In daylight, it was merely shabby. At night, it became the sort of place onto which a town could project every anxiety it had not the courage to name. Edgar Wren passed it every evening on his walk home from the offices of the Marlow Sentinel, a newspaper modest enough to survive only by offending no one of consequence. Edgar had edited that paper for 11 years, and in all that time, he had cultivated the careful habits of a man who understood that truth, in certain climates, was less profitable than reassurance. He was not a coward, precisely. Cowardice suggests drama. Edgar was something quieter and more common. He was prudent. He preferred the tempered headline, the softened phrase, the omission that let a man keep both his job and his standing. He told himself this was maturity. He told himself a town was held together less by honesty than by restraint. On an October evening, with wind scraping dry leaves along the curb and radios murmuring war reports from distant Korea through half-open windows, Edgar noticed something unusual at number 14. There was a light on upstairs. He stopped across the street and stared. The house had no power, or none that anyone knew of, yet a dull yellow glow had appeared behind the second-floor glass, and set against that glow, as though mounted for display, was a rectangle of white card bearing 4 words in thick black letters. "He knows about Miller." Edgar stood very still. The message meant nothing to him at first, except that there was no Miller on Bell Street. Then, with the slow unease of a man fitting a key into an unwanted lock, he recalled Thomas Miller, a bookkeeper at the grain office 3 streets over. A quiet fellow, church-going, unremarkable. By the next morning, the whole town had heard that federal men had visited the grain office after dawn. Miller, it was said, had once attended meetings in college, labor meetings, discussion circles. One woman claimed there were pamphlets in his desk. Another said he had subscribed to foreign journals. By noon, his name had become a shape people could fill with whatever they found most frightening. Edgar mentioned the house to no one. He did, however, walk by it again that evening. The upstairs light was on. Another white card stood in the window. "She speaks too freely." This time, the town did not need to wait until morning. By supper, whispers had already settled around Miss Clara Vale, the high school literature teacher who favored difficult books and the dangerous habit of asking students what they thought instead of telling them what to think. By the weekend, 3 parents had written letters. By Tuesday, the school board had accepted her resignation for the good of the children. Edgar watched it happen with the peculiar discomfort of a man who recognizes a pattern but still hopes not to be responsible for noticing it. On the 3rd night, the house accused a church deacon. On the 4th, a pharmacist. On the 5th, a veteran who had once signed the wrong petition in 1938 and had committed the error of believing time had buried it. The rhythm never changed. At dusk, the upstairs window lit. A message appeared. By the following day, the name implied by the accusation would be moving from rumor to suspicion, from suspicion to certainty, and from certainty to public ruin. Nobody saw anyone enter the house. Nobody admitted to knowing who was writing the messages, but the town no longer cared. The people of Marlow had begun to speak of number 14 Bell Street not with fear, but with gratitude. It had become, in their minds, a kind of warning instrument, a moral lantern, a place where hidden corruption announced itself before it had time to spread, and like many communities offered a superstition that flatters their virtue. They accepted it eagerly. At the Sentinel, letters began arriving, urging Edgar to print the messages in advance to help decent citizens remain vigilant. The mayor suggested, with the smiling menace of small-town civility, that a responsible paper ought to support the public interest. Even Reverend Pike, who had once preached against gossip with admirable force, now hinted in conversation that perhaps Providence sometimes used unusual vessels in troubled times. Edgar refused to print the words, not because he doubted them, though he told himself that was the reason, and not because he found the whole matter obscene, though part of him did. He refused because he sensed, in a dim and private way, that once the paper made itself servant to that window, it would never again be a newspaper. It would become an accomplice with ink on its hands. But he did not write against the house either. He did not challenge the rumors. He did not defend the accused. He edited around the panic. He trimmed its roughest edges. He reported consequences without naming causes. In this way, Edgar performed the oldest and most elegant surrender known to men who value respectability. He abstained loudly enough to feel innocent, while remaining silent enough to be useful. Then the message appeared for someone he knew. He has buried more than news. Edgar found himself unable to breathe for a moment. There was no name on the card, of course. There never was. But the sentence entered him with the intimacy of recognition. He thought at once of a story from 1948, when a factory boiler fault had killed 2 men and injured 6 more. Edgar had possessed evidence that the owners had ignored repeated warnings. He had chosen not to print it. The town had needed stability, he told himself. Jobs, calm. No use opening wounds. By the end of the week, the story had died a clean, respectable death in his editorial drawer. Now it stood before him in black letters above Bell Street. The next day, no officers came for Edgar. No committee summoned him. No crowd gathered outside the Sentinel. But he saw the difference in people's faces. The butcher held his gaze a second too long. The bank clerk spoke with unusual care. 2 women lowered their voices as he passed. He realized, with a chill far worse than accusation, that the town had learned how to read without names. That evening he went to the house. Bell Street was empty. Rain tapped softly at the pavement. The upstairs window shone with its usual jaundiced light, but tonight the card was blank. Edgar crossed the threshold. The front door, swollen with years, yielded under his shoulder. Inside he found dust, stripped wallpaper, bare floorboards, and the sweet rot of neglect. No furniture, no footprints, no evidence of habitation. Only the staircase climbing into shadow. He went up slowly. At the end of the hall stood the lit room. Its walls were empty. Its floor was bare. And before the window, facing the street, stood not a table, nor a lamp, nor any hidden operator, but a simple wooden frame holding a fresh white card. On it, letters were appearing by themselves, not all at once, stroke by deliberate stroke. He printed too late. Edgar stared as the sentence completed itself. Then, from somewhere below, he heard the front door open. Voices entered the house, several. Men's voices, hard, excited, certain. He recognized one as the mayor's, another as Reverend Pike's, another as Deputy Cole's. They were climbing the stairs with the eager haste of men arriving for proof. Edgar turned toward the door just as they reached the landing. For a brief second, nobody spoke. They saw him standing alone in the lit room, inches from the miraculous writing frame, his face pale, his coat wet, his hand half raised as though interrupted in the act. It was Reverend Pike who said, with sorrow polished into authority, that he had feared it might be Edgar. The mayor said he had long suspected as much. Deputy Cole asked Edgar, in the heavy tone of official courtesy, whether he intended to come quietly. Edgar tried to explain. He said the letters were writing themselves. He said the house was empty. He said the town was being fed its own terror and calling it justice. But before a man can persuade others of the impossible, he must first persuade them he is worth believing. Edgar had spent 11 years editing away precisely that kind of courage. The men looked past him to the card in the frame. Now new words were forming. He will deny it. No sentence could have harmed him more completely. The mayor's expression changed from suspicion to relief. Relief is one of the ugliest faces fear can wear. It means the danger has been found and placed safely in another man's body. They took Edgar downstairs and out into the rain. Curtains stirred all along Bell Street. Porch lights kindled. Doors opened a careful inch, then wider. By morning, the story was settled. Edgar Wren, editor of the Sentinel, had been discovered inside the very house that had warned the town for weeks. There were theories at once. He had written the messages to divert blame. He had been part of a hidden circle. He had kept secrets. He had, after all, buried more than news. No trial was needed. Public certainty is faster, cheaper, and often more satisfying. The Sentinel published a statement the next day under temporary management. It expressed shock, sadness, and confidence in the authorities. Edgar's own editorials were cited against him as evidence of slippery judgment. Miss Clara Vale's resignation was reinterpreted as foresight. The town congratulated itself on having been vigilant. Within a week, Edgar Wren had become the explanation that allowed everyone else to feel clean. And each evening, as if nothing at all had been resolved, the upstairs window at number 14 Bell Street lit once more. New cards appeared. New accusations bloomed. New neighbors were translated from familiar to suspect. The machine of fear having discovered its appetite, continued to feed. Months later, when Bell Street had exhausted most of its respectable households, and the whispers had begun circling back toward those who had first welcomed them, some of the older residents would claim they had always distrusted the house. Others would insist the town had been misled. A few would say nothing at all, because silence is often the last refuge of people who once found accusation useful. But by then the lesson had already been written more clearly than anything that ever appeared in that upstairs window. It was not the house that condemned the people of Marlow. The house merely learned their handwriting. For there are towns in every age that prefer suspicion to uncertainty and righteousness to mercy. Towns that will kneel before any altar, political, spiritual, or patriotic, provided it gives them permission to fear their neighbors with a clean conscience. And there are moments, too, when the strange enters such places, not to deceive them, but to reveal how little deception was ever needed. Because the most dangerous haunted houses are not the ones that whisper in the dark. They are the ones that speak aloud what a frightened crowd was already desperate to believe. There are thresholds in every age that men and women mistake for ordinary doors. They cross them in pride, in fear, in longing, or in ignorance, never quite realizing that some passages do not lead outward into the world, but inward, into the hidden shape of the soul. And when they find, too late, what lies there, they understand at last what is the light beyond shadow.